Good morning, everybody. This is the first opening session here today, and you can always tell the seriousness of a conference by who shows up for the opening session. So thanks for being here. I'm going to say a word about the summit and to echo some of what was said last night by all three speakers was this is a great event, and for 6 years Jed and Lee Ball and all the staff here put on a terrific event. It's world famous, and what's come out of it for all the campuses represented here and have been represented over the past 6 years, it really is quite extraordinary. I want to talk about politics, and the caveat is that not just policy, but politics. And the caveat is that everybody in the world is an expert on three things: politics, sex, and religion. And so you stray into dangerous territory here. I'm not going to talk about the last two, but I am going to talk about politics. And I want to make a distinction. The market that we seem to worship a good bit in this culture is where you and I say I, me, and mine. The pronoun is all about us. Politics is where we talk about the things we have in common. It's we and it's our common wealth, and it's our future, it's our children, and it's how broadly we define that political arena. So I want to talk about politics, and some things happen in the political arena that don't happen anywhere else, where we decide about taxation. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court justice, once said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization. So roads and bridges and schools and postal service and security, those are things we pay by taxation. Markets don't do those well. Politics is where we define and decide issues of security, and war and peace, and fairness, research and development. And here, as we celebrate the market deployment of solar energy, I want you to note, and I want to say this very clearly, that it wasn't the market that developed photovoltaics or wind power or energy efficiency technologies. Those happened because of federal R&D, research and development funding, way back. And they never paid back. The internet happened because you and I, in that political arena, decided through our representatives and so forth and presidents, we decided to put certain amounts of money to develop things that were iffy and risky. Markets didn't do that. That was done by you and me through the federal government. Markets don't decide issues of equity very well, as I'll explain in a moment. They decide issues of war and peace. And when you get politics wrong, bad things happen. People die. And so think of the decision a number of years back to invade Iraq. We now know that decision was based on faulty information, possibly and quite probably fraudulent information. That was a political choice that we made by default, and it was badly made, and the destabilizing effects in the Middle East ripple on, and they will affect your future and as far out as you can imagine a future. And so politics is that public arena. It's where we do the public business. It is not antithetical to markets. They need to work in tandem. Markets alone don't do very well. They're prone to corruption and monopoly and inequity and all kinds of things. It is government where you and I say, we the people, say that these are the rules of the road for economic behavior. Markets really don't decide property. You and I decide that through our public processes, and if they're corrupted, then those decisions are corrupted. So two other caveats. One is very simply that we don't know, frankly, whether a democracy is up to the transition that we have to make to a very different era, an era when the planet will be warmer, with all, as Gene McCarthy said last night, all the ripple effects that go out from rising temperatures. It isn't just you turn a thermostat up here and nothing else wobbles over here. You turn a thermostat of the planet up, as we have done and will continue to do for a long time, and lots of other things come undone over there. This is one system, and we have to begin to adjust our thinking to this single system of a planet that has a lithosphere and cryosphere and a biosphere and an atmosphere. And it's that system that we have to think about. Now, Finally, is politics messy? You bet it is. Every one of you is thinking, oh my God, he's wading off into a swamp, to use a metaphor current now. I don't want to drain the swamp, I just want to wade into this messy arena. And politics are messy for reasons that we've known about for a long time. James Madison, in his Federalist Paper number 51, described our tendency to organize by factions and by interest groups, and you all know that. So we have a Tea Party movement, it's fractured into half a dozen other separate movements. We have a liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and we have corporate interests and so forth. We are prone to factionalism. And Madison assumed in that paper in the Federalist, Article 51 in the Federalist Papers, Madison assumed that that would be diluted by the simple size of the country. A bigger country was better, he thought, than a smaller one. And that thinking ran counter to what people at that time were assuming. Republics and democracies need by definition to be small. Madison said no. But politics are messy. They're irrational because you and I are irrational. We're a lot better at rationalizing things than we are making rational judgments. This is why every university has an economics department where they assume rational economic man, but then they have marketing departments in business schools where people, we're not rational. You can raise the price of something and you can sell more of it with proper marketing than you can at a lower price. We're just not that rational. So let me start, and I want to put the big things on the agenda. 3 slides here. These are the best graphics I have seen on climate change. And so this is simply accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. And the background rate, as everyone here knows, was 280 parts per million. We're now, as of what I saw yesterday, at 408.84 parts per million. And then the temperature. The outer circle, 2 degrees centigrade, and that's centigrade, not Fahrenheit, 2 degrees centigrade warming was thought to be the guardrail for safety. Beyond that, all hell would break loose. And then at Paris last year, better data, and the more we know, the more we have to reason that it ought to be the guardrail should be 1.5 degrees centigrade. But you notice we're getting awfully close to that. And temperature continues to rise, and we see the effects of this virtually every day. The third graphic is our carbon budget. And so if 1.5 degrees centigrade is the outer boundary of safety, and some even believe that that's way too high, but notice how close we're getting. This data is a year old. This is assembled by the Washington Post. That data is now a year old, and so we've edged even closer to this. And then I want to say the debate now about the human future, you think of this as, say, 2 bookends. This is one bookend, and this is the falling price of energy and efficiency, and it's fallen dramatically, faster than people would predict. And if this is what you focus on, you're, quote, an optimist. And solar is being deployed around the world at rates no one had predicted even 2 years ago, although it will slow in the United States, according to the New York Times yesterday. And of course, this is the other end. So these are the bookends of the rational debate. These 2 curves are both true. And they summarize other curves. The Keeling curve, which is on the screen, this is the annual breathing in and out of CO2 in the atmosphere. The Keeling curve dates back to David Keeling, the scientist who began to record carbon dioxide from Mauna Loa in 1958. And at that point, it was about 315 parts per million. We're now at 408.84. And so that curve is also a summary of other curves. As Betsy Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, explains, we're losing species at the rate which puts roughly half of the biota of the planet in jeopardy within this century. And I'm old enough to say that that is not far away. We need to be concerned about that. So this is a summary curve. And so, in effect, there's kind of a race between those first 3 slides, a spiraling increase of CO2 and temperature of carbon dioxide, and our capacity to respond. And there are certain inflection points that we have to meet. So we better be about the downward spiral, and because of your work here and the work of Amory Lovins, Gina McCarthy, and many others. That downward spiral, I think, is a real prospect, but to stabilize somewhere below 2 degrees centigrade warming. But there are other things involved here. There's ocean acidification, there are problems of extinction and equity and so forth. This is making the news now. This is Larsen C ice shelf, which is about ready to break off. It's a roughly Delaware, state of Delaware size chunk of ice. It itself won't raise sea levels, but coming behind it, there is a lot of land-based ice that will raise sea levels. And this is kind of the cork in the bottle. When this Larsen C breaks up, there'll be a lot more ice come into the oceans. And then just a point of science. There are two things I want to say here. One is that the warming effect of what we've already done hasn't been fully felt yet, because most of the warming, as described in the slide, has taken place in the oceans, this vast reservoir of heat. At some point, the oceans won't absorb heat at the rate that they do now. And there's some evidence, some scientists believe that that point is very close at hand, but be that as it may, we're right now not as warm as we otherwise would be had all the warming gone into land and into the atmosphere. The other point I want to make is this. On all of this global warming stuff and all of the climate anomalies and records being set, and we're setting records at a record-setting pace, and warmest warms and hottest hots and coldest colds and windiest wind conditions and heaviest rainfalls, those things are being set records at a record-breaking pace. We've never seen anything like this on the planet since we've been on the planet as Homo sapiens for the last couple 100,000 years. But there's a lag effect. And so what comes out of our tailpipes and smokestacks doesn't really affect climate for 20 to 30 years. And so what we're seeing now in terms of anomalies, the wildfires and incredible heat in places like Southern California, that's not a result of 408 parts per million. We don't know what 408 parts per million will do. That's more like 380 to 385 parts per million. Follow what I'm saying? There's a lag effect. And we're playing with what scientists call a non-linear system. And so this is the problem we have. Carbon, once it's in the atmosphere, stays there for a long time. This is the core of the current debate about the effects of what's being called the Anthropocene, this human-dominated era. And since carbon stays in the atmosphere for a long time, we're in effect creating, as Bill McKibben describes it, a new planet. He calls it Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H, but it's a different world. It's not the world I grew up in or you grew up in. That world is changing. And so what McKibben in his talks, in contrast to some of what's been heard here, says is we don't know that we're going to make it, but if we do make it, it'll be on a very different kind of planet. And so that's simply the sobering reality. That's simply the science. And if that's depressing, suck it up and get over it. That is simply the hard news that you have to face when you go to a doctor and tells you got a broken leg or cancer or whatever. You have to just simply accept certain facts because, as Gina McCarthy noted last night, they're science. Now, I want to ask a question, and this gets to the heart of what I want to talk about in politics. We came into a really nasty era in American political life, and most of you, if you're a student, have grown up your entire adult life or life to this point has been lived in an era of what's called bipartisan or non-bipartisanship and political conflict, and it wasn't always this way. It's never been, politics has never been easy. It's never really been all that nice, but it didn't have to be this bad. And so the heart of the American legal system that Gina McCarthy described last night, environmental law grew out of an era of bipartisan dialogue that created the Environmental Protection Agency. That was Richard Nixon. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Wilderness Act, all of these bills, the legislative structure around the environment was created by Republicans and Democrats both. Imagine that. They talked to each other. They socialized together. They played poker at night together. They liked each other. And it wasn't the way it is now. So the question is, what happened? And here's where the going gets tough. There was something called the Powell Memo. Lewis Powell was a Richmond attorney, later became a Supreme Court justice. Lewis Powell wrote a memo, which he distributed through corporate channels. It was a private memo released later. It was not a public document until sometime later, describing what he meant was a counterattack. Now, you have to remember the history. This was the history of the Vietnam years. burning cities, hippies, the civil rights movement. It was a contentious era in American political life. And Powell felt, and the impact of the memo was felt throughout the corporate world, that we have to counterattack. They're destroying the world we helped to build, and America was built by corporations. So the Powell memo led to the creation of the Heritage Foundation and lots of other organizations. They gave legitimacy to ideas that had been thought to be discredited, that came out of the robber baron era some years before. Here's the second problem. The way we've dealt with corporations, and the first one here, the Santa Clara County case, is the kind of the wellspring of thinking about the role of corporations. And what the Santa Clara County decision was about was to give corporations the legal rights of persons. Now, you and I are persons. You're going to die. You can be in one place at one time. Your assets are limited. Corporations are none of those things. They are eternal if they're well managed or well run. They're simply pots of money looking for a highest rate of return. And so to give them personhood under the rights, let's say the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, of due process and personhood and freedom of speech and so forth, was an incredibly mischievous thing to do. When you look back at the history of this, that wasn't what the Supreme Court decided at all. That was written in the head notes, the preface to that decision, by the Secretary to the Supreme Court, who himself was a railroad attorney and worked for the U.S. railroads, which at that time were kind of equivalent to the Silicon Valley. And the court didn't decide this, but it was assumed that they had decided this. And if they hadn't at this point, it probably would have been decided that way later, given simply the power of money. But notice the mischief here. The second case here, Buckley versus Vallejo, said that the expenditure of money is a form of freedom of speech. And so that meant that large pots of money had a very big megaphone. You and I have a very small megaphone, one person, one vote kind of thing. But the Koch brothers have a very big megaphone, and their impact on American political life is obviously then that much greater. Then Citizens United, more recent decision, opened the floodgates to money in politics, and so the power of corporations was vouchsafed. This happens to be Rex Tillerson, now Secretary of State. And it's been shown that Tillerson, or well, not Tillerson personally, but ExxonMobil, knew what the climate effects of burning their chief product, oil and gasoline and so forth, would be. In 1977, their scientists, they had assembled a very able group of top-notch scientists, and they determined that yes, this burning oil and gas would heat the planet with all the effects thereunto. They knew that, but they were not held accountable. Now here's where the going gets tough. I grew up in an Eisenhower Republican home, and I still consider myself more or less within the boundaries of that Eisenhower Republican philosophy, where you paid your bills and integrity mattered, and office was not for public enrichment and so forth, and Dwight Eisenhower was a considerable public servant. Here's what's happened in my lifetime. The American political dialogue has shifted to the right. Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan would not be permitted in the current Republican Party. That's how far right it's gone. And if you think that this is conservatism, I don't think so. I think this is something different. This is what political scientists, of which I am one, call libertarianism, simply getting rid of all government, that there's no public agency, post office to anything else, that's worth having. And so the privatization of virtually all public endeavor is the core of the libertarian viewpoint. Don't tread on me is kind of its motto. Nancy MacLean, a historian at Duke University, has written a marvelous little book called Democracy and Change, which is on the lower left-hand corner of this slide. But it describes this transition rightward from more or less a center, but the center has shifted right. And the interesting part of this is already conservatism. The interesting part is that American attitudes by poll data haven't really shifted that much. Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker, in their book Off Center, describe what I'm putting on the screen right now, that we're pretty much where we've always been. Americans tend to be pragmatic problem solvers. We're good at that. We're good at deploying technology, fixing machinery, deploying things like cell phones and developing the internet. That's our strength. We're very good at that. But our attitudes politically didn't really shift all that much. I want to change just a second to a market comment. If you don't know the book by Carl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, put it on your to-read list. It was written in 1944, still in print. And it was a classic at the time. And he described this great transformation from a market as a place where you went and bought vegetables and so forth, to the market as an abstraction. And one of the points of the book, and it bears careful reading and repeated reading, one of the points of the book is that in that transition to the market, we lost control of some of the social variables. Markets where you bought and sold vegetables or real things brought communities together, like the current farmers market. Markets as abstractions drive us apart. They are hard to control. They are almost impossible to regulate. And so markets in that abstract sense are difficult and more problematic places. And then there's this issue of money. Jane Mayer's book on the left and Zephyr Teachout's book on the right document corruption in American political life. We allowed a lot of money to come in. So if you ask, why did global warming occur? You've got a series of issues here. If you're a good attorney, you do what attorneys do. You say, follow the money. And the money goes back to some very wealthy people who have managed to corrupt American political life. That's roughly the sum total of money that's gone into corrupt decisions in Congress and state legislatures and so forth. And then you can think of this on a worldwide basis. Oxfam study on global wealth. 8 people control more wealth than the bottom half of humankind, 3.65 billion people now. And then in the United States, it's not quite that bad. 400 people, easily you could fit them in the lower part of the auditorium here. 400 people control more net wealth than, I'm told now, it's up to 200 million Americans. Very quickly, this slide depicts something that worries me a good bit. In my generation, I was born in 1944. In my generation, you had a pretty good life prospect ahead of you. But you'll notice here, if the later you were born, the less wealth you're going to have, the fewer life opportunities you're going to have. And this is simply statistical data. It's not political particularly. This is just hardcore social data. And so now we're coming into a world where America as a land of opportunity is fading out relative to most all of the other OECD countries. And then this bothers me even more. This is a survey of millennial-age young people about their attachment and the response to a question, how important is it to live in a democracy? And you'll notice on the right-hand side, that column in the right-hand side bordered by red shows that it's just not all that important anymore. Well below 30% of millennials now say it's important to live in a democracy. Now the issue, this is where I think it bears on climate change. The issue is that, as Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others ever tried. It is messy, it can be irrational, it is difficult, it demands a lot of people. You've got to be a good citizen. So how do you be a good citizen in a democracy? Well, it takes a lot of time. You have to study things, you have to know things to be good at this. But that is no longer the priority that it once was in this country. Then there's the issue of the press, and the slide just portrays the concentration of the press. When Ben Bedikian wrote his classic book, Media Monopoly, back in 1970, he complained that there were only 50 or 55 major media outlets. We're now down to 4 or 5. And so increasing the concentration of the media warps what we know about politics. This simply portrays climate change on evening news and various networks, including Fox, ABC, and NBC, and CBS. The most important issue on the human agenda, I think without any equivocation, the most important issue on the human agenda is nowhere on the media. And so we ask, why do people go into denial? Part is they don't hear about it. They're not exposed to the science that Gina McCarthy talked about last night. And then there's this issue. I hate to put a lot of books on the screen, but this is an important dialogue. The one on your left, Richard Hofstadter, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, was written in 1963, and he described, or historically, and he was a great historian, described historically our tendency to not like smart people. They're too intellectual, and we have all kinds of ways to describe them. The middle book by Al Gore, and then the right book by Susan Jacoby, The Age of Unreason. She attributes a good bit of this recently to television, simply sitting, as we do now, on average 9 hours in front of one screen or another. And it's increasingly difficult for us to think through complex problems. Does that look familiar? How many of you are on your Twitter account right now? Oh, hundreds of hands went up. This is an issue, and Albert Einstein had some thoughts about it. There is now a serious problem of addiction to the internet and to screens. Almost every college worth its salt has an office now that deals with, or officers who deal with internet addiction by students. I want to make a couple last points here. This is my district, or our district in Ohio. That is called gerrymandering. Elbert Jerry was a guy that lived back in the 1700s, early 1800s, and to get the right political outcome, you gerrymander districts so that they're, and you know all about this in North Carolina, so that they fit your certain political proclivity. So every 10 years, the state legislatures take census data, and then if they're Republican or Democratic control, they will gerrymander the district so they get the maximum advantage out. So they draw the lines around people. If you want to draw the district that has all left-handed, blue-eyed, 5-foot 5-inch, coke-drinking Lithuanians, you can do that. It's simply a computer program. You plug in the data, and it will give you the district. In our district, this gives us Jim Jordan, and I don't want to talk about him. Now, here comes the final shot here. This is political theory, and this is political science 101. What do we now do? And I've got some thoughts about that. Number one comes from Edmund Burke. We need liberals and we need conservatives. They're not opposing things. They're flip sides of the same coin. And every one of you, if you're young, every one of you is going to be a liberal on some issues, conservative on others, and it will change over time. It's called growing up. You'll be a different person at 50 than you are at 15 or 25. And so Burke, who was one of the great founders of conservatism, not libertarianism, but conservatism, said that you and I are simply trustees. And our job is to pass on an entailed inheritance of laws, institutions, customs, religion, and so forth from a distant past to a distant future. But we're just midway. We're trustees. And that was conservatism. And change a couple of things in that. If Burke, who lived in the 18th century, were here now, he would include climate change and species and ecological resilience and so forth to that part of that entailed inheritance on which all the other parts of the entailed inheritance depend. And then this is liberalism. It's a little bit harder to define, but it's the other side of that coin, and these are not opposing viewpoints. Some people make a very good living of dividing us between liberals and conservatives. That's wrong. So gaze down that list of things that liberalism or liberals have done, and they're not all great. Some were done badly, and some were done incompletely, and conservatives always have kind of the brakes on because they want to conserve the things that are worth conserving in the past, and that is a noble thing as well. But we're both of those things. And then there's this issue from Thomas Jefferson. If we think that we can be ignorant and democratic, think again. We can't be. And James Madison, who worried a lot about the things that we knew in freedom of press, we are risking now with fake news and so forth a farce that he described, where a lot of people are ignorant and kept ignorant and deliberately so. George Orwell adds something to this. If you lose a democracy and in an authoritarian takeover, here's what happens. You first corrupt the language. You take words that had a dependable, authentic meaning, and you corrupt the meaning of those words. And so those words, what does patriotism mean in climate change? It doesn't necessarily mean a gun-toting pickup truck and with a rifle rack in the back. It's a different kind of patriotism. And here's a hard fact, and I think this has not been emphasized enough here. This is Frederick Douglass, the wonderful, literate former slave who became a staunch advocate of freedom and civil rights and so forth. Power doesn't give up. And if we expect that the market is all going to be kumbaya and it's all going to be love and roses as we go into this transitional era where there's a lot less of a lot of things for people, and I'm all for the solar transition. This is not an argument in any way against that, to the contrary. But this is just to say, get prepared for a struggle. So here's how change happens. This is Selma, and that's John Lewis, right in the foreground of that picture. Fractured skull. He's now in Congress, one of the revered members of Congress. That was a struggle. They weren't going to give up. There was no market that was going to free people from racism and from the practices of lynching and discrimination and so forth. That was a struggle. And here we are, Women's March in Chicago. D.C. This is the day after the inauguration. This is struggle. This is a battle. That's William Barber here in North Carolina, the founder of Moral Monday. That's a battle. That's a struggle. You've got to fight. As a citizen, you have to be prepared for that struggle. It isn't going to happen just only if you're a good consumer, although I'm very much for that. These are some of the kids in this lawsuit, the Juliana lawsuit that's winding its way through the federal court system out west. And this is all about the standing of young people on issues of climate change. And they'll win this case. They've got, I think they're going to win, maybe until it gets to the Supreme Court. This is a similar lawsuit in Europe. Pope Francis has had if you haven't read Laudato Si, do it, put that on your to-read list also. And then every place I go, this is Oberlin, Ohio. 3 of my former students stayed in town and started a development company, age 20, 21, 22. This is what they built. Gold-rated, 3 buildings, one behind these 2, 33 condominiums right in the heart of downtown, helped revitalize our little downtown in the small city of Oberlin, Ohio, where I live. They've now formed a development company working in Cleveland, and they've done now 4 big projects, incredible inner-city development, redeveloping these old Rust Belt cities. That's leadership. I want to close this by saying this. This era is going to leave. It'll end, and there will be a lot of wreckage. It isn't just due to Donald Trump. It's due to our neglect as citizens. We were much better consumers than we've been citizens. This is the hotel right across the street from the development that the kids have done. We finished this last year. This is entirely solar powered from an off-site solar array, 2.27 megawatt solar array, part of which is dedicated to the hotel. This is platinum rated, and it's just a hotel, just a building. The question is, what can happen in this building, and what can happen here at Appalachian State? First big event we held was last fall. It seemed like a million years ago, but that's 3 days of great speakers talking about the next economy after fossil fuels. That's solar transition. So we had investors and solar technicians and politicians. That's Arnold Schwarzenegger on the left, Mike Duffy from Time Magazine on the right, Tom Steyer, or in the middle, Tom Steyer on the right, is part of the conversation. And the question for us is, what should we in the academic world be saying now? What should we be talking about at this point in history? This is another view of the same conference center, the same event. This is what's coming up. You may not be able to read all that on the screen, but this is an event that will kick off a series of national conferences. The first will be at Oberlin, Ohio, Oberlin College. And we're asking, how did we get to 2016? And it's not intended to be anti-anybody. It's intended to understand our history. How did we get to the point where we got in 2016, whatever you think that was? And stretch it back to the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon or all the way back to the Constitution, doesn't matter. But we've got a lot of deferred maintenance in our political house that needs to be rectified. The roof is leaking, the floors are sagging, the windows are busted. We've got to fix some things, and call it gerrymandering, call it voting rights, and so forth. So this event kicks off a national conversation, first in Oberlin, then Denver and Los Angeles, and then back to Atlanta, culminating in a book or blueprint on what do we do after 2020, let's say. So among the speakers, Jane Mayer, whose book you saw previously, and Akhil Amar, the great constitutional law scholar from Yale, and 25 people over 3 days. So what's my advice to you? And these are the 2 last slides. For those of you who are young or old or whatever your age is, read. Become a reader. You've got to know more than you typically or your cohort now knows. You've got to read more. Read everything you can. And then connect. Understand, when you saw Amory Lovins last night, you saw a magnificent systems thinking mind. Learn how to connect and look at data and connect climate change and energy policy and economy with equity and all these things, so you have a worldview that actually works on this planet. Run for office. Get engaged in the political system. If you have any, and run for, I don't care whether it's a city council or student council or state legislature, get engaged in the system. We need good people now more than ever before. And then talk to your representatives, email them, write them letters, and so forth. Organize, get together and organize. That's the only way things happen. People don't give up easily. and get out and vote. And vote like the future really does matter. And last thing I'll say is this. Martin Luther King gave an early version of this talk, which was a year before he was killed, at Oberlin, a commencement address. And his point in this, as you read this, I'm not going to read it to you, but the point is that we can be too late. And one of the great things about coming to Appalachian State is I'm with a lot of people here who aren't going to be too late, people who care about the future, have their sleeves rolled up. And hope is a verb, with its sleeves rolled up. If you're optimistic, you really don't know enough. If you're pessimistic, that's a sin. Don't go there. The logical sweet spot in your attitude toward the future is be hopeful. But if you're hopeful, you have to do something. You can't sit on your backside. You've got to be engaged. If you're optimistic, probably not. If you're in despair, you're paralyzed. But if you're hopeful, you will act. But there is such a thing as being too late. And on this road to a future, we've been passing off-ramps to better destinations than where we're headed. When Amory Lovins wrote that wonderful paper in Foreign Affairs in 1976, classic paper, the most cited paper ever in the history of that great journal, he was showing us a different way to build the energy part of the future. Now we need to understand a different way to build the common part of our political future. So this is kind of what I've told you in summary, but I want to thank you, all of you here, and Jed and Lee and all the people at Appalachian State, for organizing this effort so that we're not going to be too late in North Carolina, and all the universities represented here are going to be part of that process. Thank you all very much.